welcome everyone. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar today looking at annexation and what it means, US and international perspectives. This webinar is part one of a three-part series co-organized with the Foundation along with the Middle East Institute and co-moderated by my colleague, Khaled Al-Gindi, who is a senior fellow and director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israel Affairs at the Middle East Institute. Quick context for this event. Under the agreement governing the new Israeli government, formal annexation can be advanced as early as July 1st. For its part, the US is, of course, deeply involved in planning and mapping annexation, and Secretary of State Pompeo is actually in Israel today. So there's a lot of chatter going on about if or how or whether annexation is going to happen, what can be done to stop it. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. Instead, these three webinars are going to be looking at what annexation means in practice for various stakeholders and perspectives. And today we're focusing on what it means for the US and international actors and what might come next. In parts 2 and 3, we'll hear from views from Palestine and Israel. And over to Khaled.
Thanks, Lara, and welcome to all of our audience. To shed light on today's topic, we have an all-star panel of experts representing diverse perspectives on the topic. I'll go over the list briefly, but you have longer bios for all of our panelists, which are available on both the MEI and FMEP sites for this event. Going in alphabetical order, first we have Tamara Kaufman-Wittes, a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, who also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the administration. Second, we have Noura Irakat, who is a human rights lawyer and assistant professor at Rutgers University. Noura is also the author of a recent and highly acclaimed book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Third, we have Hugh Lovett, who is a policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he focuses on EU policy toward the Middle East peace process, domestic Palestinian politics, and Israeli regional policy. Last and certainly not least, we're honored to be joined by Marwan Muasher, who is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research in Washington and Beirut on the Middle East. Marwan's career spanned the areas of diplomacy, development, civil society, and communications, including serving as Jordan's foreign minister, deputy prime minister, minister of information, ambassador to the US, first ambassador to Israel, as well as a member of the Jordanian Senate and vice president of external affairs at the World Bank. Welcome to all of our panelists.
Great. And the format for today's webinar, and this will be familiar to people who've been on our webinars before, this will be a moderator-led discussion with the panelists. In addition to our own questions, we welcome audience questions, which can be submitted via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time starting now. We'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A box, and so will the panelists, and we'll try to incorporate as many of your questions as possible into the discussion. Please note, of course, this is being recorded and will be posted online immediately after the webinar ends. I should also say, do not put your questions into the chat box because we probably won't see them. The chat box is for technical issues and is being monitored by people who are not the ones moderating the panel. The last thing I want to note is that this panel was initially advertised as lasting for an hour. It's actually an hour and 15 minutes. That was a mistake. We have 4 great panelists, and we want to make sure they all have plenty of time to give their views. So with that, we are going to begin. And back to you, Khaled, for the first round.
Great, thanks. So in this first round, I thought we would start off with some scene-setting questions. I'm going to put the first question to Noura. As an expert in international law, could you lay out for us the legal context for the current debate around Israeli annexation? Annexation, which is de facto, has already been going on for many decades, but where we're now looking at the very real possibility of de jure annexation. What, if anything, would this change in the eyes of international law?
Thank you, Khaled. Thank you, Lara, and to the other panelists. That's a great question and something that would, springs up from the ground, as Palestinians know full well that even without the formal annexation of nearly 60% of the West Bank territories, also known as Area C, they're already off limits. They do not have access to their lands. They do not have access to the water under the lands. They do not have access to the borders in what is tantamount to de facto annexation. It's annexation by fact. So to distinguish that from de jure, the framework of de facto annexation is able to exceed the realm of a formal declaration of a war crime because of the acquisition of territory by force, otherwise prohibited under the Fourth Geneva Convention, and which rises to a grave breach of the Geneva Convention and is thus a war crime. But short of that declaration, what de facto annexation does for us in international law is still gives us a lot of room for advocacy, namely to claim that the unequal access to those Palestinian lands violates a number of human rights treaties about equal access, whether it has to do with international law relating to water, international law relating to civil and political rights, international law relating to economic, cultural, and social rights. The reason that that has evaded the reach of more formal mechanisms that will now be triggered by de jure annexation is because Israel has proclaimed and sustained that these territories, one, are not occupied as a matter of law at all because they lack a sovereign, and therefore it's the missing reversion or argument that they are there and will recognize the humanitarian application of law. But two, and more significantly from the US context, the reason that the US and the international community has actually tolerated this legal argument is because Israel has sustained a fiction of temporality, that these are all temporary settlements until and when a permanent peace is reached, and the fiction of military necessity, that these are not in fact permanent civilian settlements, but instead they are done under the auspices of military necessity or exigency until and when they can retreat. Those have been fictions sustained by the political process. Once de jure annexation or the formal annexation is set into force, all of that fades away, and it should trigger otherwise mechanisms that have been obscured, including the declaration of that annexation as a war crime, including the 2001 draft articles of state responsibility, which means that no states can recognize this annexation. It's an obligation of non-recognition, and it triggers a number of other mechanisms that we can use. But obviously, or not so obviously, but as I lay out in the book, all those mechanisms are also severely limited because of the political context and the political impediments to actually apply them. And we're seeing that on full display in the ICC bid, which we can discuss later.
Thanks, Noura. Turning now to Hugh, could you set the scene for us in Europe? Obviously, in Europe, there are many other issues and distractions going on, not the least of which is the coronavirus pandemic. Who in Europe is actually paying attention to this issue, and what challenges does annexation pose to European interests? Hugh, can you
you're
hear
muted.
us?
Sorry, I knew I was going to do that. So as I was saying, I think it's quite clear for us who work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the European context that this is an issue that often gets crowded out by other issues. And I think this year alone, I've kind of lost track of how many conflicts we have simmering on our borders, from Libya, rising tensions around Cyprus, Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. And as you said, Khaled, also now the coronavirus. And I think and having to deal with that, and that obviously sucks out a lot of, limits the bandwidth and internal capacities and the attention span of ministers. But I think it's also quite clear that, if one just needs to look at the news today, yesterday, and all the speculation about what the EU may or may not do, and supposed leaks. And some of these stories are more or less accurate than each other. But I think it is clear now that this is an issue that has arrived on the plate of foreign ministers, and there'll be I think, quite an important discussion happening on Friday in Brussels amongst the foreign ministers of the 27 member states. But I think it's important to note that in parallel to this, the sort of working level consultations between member states and the EU institutions have been proceeding for quite some time now. Initially this was much more in the run-up to the launch of the US plan and how the EU should position itself, and the sort of laborious task of consensus making. But I think with the declaration, or with the announcement of annexation as part of the new government's political platform, I think we've seen these internal consultations now shift towards scenario planning and preparations for annexation, both with a view to how to prevent it potentially, and then how to react to it. So I think in terms of scene setting, that would be the main thing. And the last point I'd say in terms of why this matters. And depending on who you ask, you have different answers. But I think one needs to take seriously the fact that the Oslo peace process, whether we like it or not, and the two-state solution have become tenets of faith for the EU, as is the international order itself, and of course the fate of Palestinians and also Israelis, which Europeans do care genuinely about. And I think all these factors are kind of being discussed, of course, in terms of what happens going forward. And so I think this is quite a critical moment also for European policy.
Thanks to Tamara. There's a lot obviously to unpack on the U.S. front. Can you take some pieces of this and help us understand what are exactly U.S. interests at stake here? Why does annexation matter to the United States? Why have previous administrations supported the two-state solution, at least rhetorically, while on the other hand, the Trump administration is moving openly against that in favor of annexation? Could you put this in perspective for us?
Yeah, Khaled, thanks. And it's great to be part of this wonderful panel and what I expect will be a really rich conversation. So I'm glad to be here. I think it's worth going back to the question of why the United States got into the game of Arab-Israeli peacemaking in the first place. That commitment to a two-state solution, which I'll come back to in a minute, is relatively recent in US policy. But the US got into this business because it saw Arab-Israeli peacemaking as necessary as a way of stabilizing a region where stability was important to the United States, because the US was building its influence, its dominance amongst the great powers in this region. And it didn't want that to be challenged by violent conflict or by vectors that would give outside powers ways into the region. And so that's what this has always been about. That's still relevant, I think, for the United States today. And so the US has always supported direct negotiations between Israel and its Arab interlocutors, whether those interlocutors were Egypt or Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, or the Palestinians. And that's been because of that desire for negotiated agreements that could stabilize the region. And it's also because for many decades, that's what Israeli leaders insisted on. They wanted direct negotiations to produce agreements because that would compel Arab parties to recognize Israel and accept Israel's existence in the region. And so the US support for what we call today a two-state solution grew out of that support for direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and grew out of the mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO that was one component of the Oslo agreements in 1993. But the US embraced the notion of Palestinian statehood only in 2004, after the Oslo process had hit the skids, okay? We were coming out of the second Intifada. And the Bush administration embraced Palestinian statehood partly because it saw statehood as a way of kind of pushing Arafat to take greater responsibility for his role in the conflict, for his part in the conflict, and a way of enforcing a set of expectations on him. And then I think the American support for Palestinian statehood also became a meaningful political horizon for Palestinians, that the United States understands and supports the idea that the outcome of this process should be two states for two peoples who have equal claims and equal right to self-determination and equal demands for dignity. And, you know, I think where we are today is that Trump came into office and overturned all of that. He overturned concern by the United States for maintaining stability. He likes to shake things up. He doesn't mind instability. He doesn't mind other external actors getting engaged in the region. And he doesn't much care about the outcome to this conflict or about the claims of the two sides. There are people in his administration who have very clear views and preferences about the outcomes. But I don't think the president really does have many preferences about the outcomes. And so I think it's been the preferences of those other people and the preferences of the Israeli government that have driven the Trump administration to where it is today.
Great, thanks, Tamara. Marwan, turning now to the region that you're actually in, but before we get into responses from Arab leaders to the threat of a US-backed annexation, could you lay out for us what annexation would mean for the Arab world as a political and practical matter, particularly where you are in Jordan, but also in Egypt, both countries obviously that have peace treaties with Israel?
Marwan, you're muted.
Sorry. I think it's important to remind ourselves, why did Arabs go to Madrid in the first place? Why did this whole process, peace process, start? The Arabs went to Madrid because of a promise to end the occupation and establish a Palestinian state. That was not just a Palestinian interest, that was an Arab interest. Today with annexation, the bottom line is annexation tells us the two-state solution is over. Israel is not interested in a two-state solution. And if Israel is not interested in a two-state solution, what does Arab recognition of Israel mean anymore? What do the Oslo agreements mean? What does the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty mean? If today we are dealing with an entity, Israel, that is directly working to kill the two-state solution, and in Jordan's particular case, Jordan is concerned that if a two-state solution is killed, the solution might come at its own expense. In other words, if Israel is not interested in a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and if Israel is not interested in a Palestinian majority in areas under its control, something which is a reality today, then the only logical solution for Israel is to try to have a solution at Jordan's expense by creating conditions under which Palestinians might leave their land into Jordan. This is what it means, and I think that it cannot come cost-free. Israelis cannot feel they can do anything they want without affecting the whole concept of peace and the whole concept of Arab recognition of Israel.
All right, fantastic. That's the scene setting round. Now we start digging in deeper. So I'm going to stick with Marwan here. Marwan, so the response of Arab leaders so far to what is an increasingly serious and even imminent threat of formal annexation, without even the cover of, talking about peace that we've had over de facto annexation that Nora talked about, the response has been remarkably muted. Can you talk about why this is the case and what that portends with respect to likely responses or non-responses, as some are probably counting on, to annexation from the Arab world?
I would not use the word remarkably. I would use the word disappointingly muted. Indeed, Arab reaction has been disappointing, to say the least, both at the popular and the official levels. Whether this is because, you know, Arabs are preoccupied with other issues, whether it is partly a result of the COVID-19 crisis and people, you know, don't go out in the street for whatever reason. Yes, the Arab reaction has been muted and might not change until it becomes clear of what annexation means. I think many Arab countries also are reluctant to get into a direct confrontation with the United States over this. And maybe they're thinking that, you know, maybe this is just an election campaign issue, maybe Trump will not be re-elected, whatever. But the bottom line, Lara, is that two Arab states, that, yes, will be directly affected. The Palestinians, of course, will be directly affected by this, and Jordan will be directly affected by this. And if annexation goes through, it is going to be very difficult for a country like Jordan to argue that it can go on with Israel with business as usual, that it can have a gas treaty with Israel, that it can work closely with an entity that's clearly working against its own interest. This is when I think you will start to see reactions. And this is where neither the Palestinian Authority nor the Jordanian leadership can stand still and do nothing about it. If annexation indeed goes through, as I expect it will, many people still feel that this might be, just a threat, and that the Israeli government will not go through with this. I don't believe in that. I think that the Netanyahu government wants to make use of the fact that Trump is still in power and wants to maximize this to its own advantage. Nobody knows what will happen in November. And so I think they will try to maximize their gains before November comes. That is going to come at particularly, in addition to the Palestinians, at Jordan's expense. I was the first ambassador to Israel, and yet I wrote an article last week in which I questioned the whole Jordan-Israel peace treaty, if indeed we are dealing with a solution other than a two-state solution.
Fantastic. And I'm going to ask my colleagues who are monitoring the chat box if they can throw a link to that article into the chat box if people want to read it. I recommend it highly. Turning to Hugh, we've seen some strong and less strong statements and noises coming from European officials, EU officials, member states, something from the House of Lords last night, I think. And there's a meeting on Friday in Brussels on this. We've seen talk about consequences, potentially, real consequences. How serious do you see any of that being? And how does it fit into the internal politics we're seeing today in Europe when it comes to Israel, in particular with the blocking role played by the Visegrad states? And then we have actors like Germany that seem really intent on not having conflict with Israel and that are working at this at a domestic level as well.
So I'll start by underscoring, I think, an important point, which is, from the European position, from the position of the EU and member states, there's a lot of, I suppose you call them interests that are directly threatened by annexation. I mentioned this briefly again, like the two-state solution, Israel as a Jewish majority and democratic state, Palestinian statehood, which the EU and member states have invested a lot of money in international law. And I say this because I think this is really something to bear in mind in terms of the seriousness of which EU officials are taking this and European governments. And in terms of what to expect, I think the way consensus lies amongst the 27 member states is probably slightly higher than some of us would have expected for the reasons that I've mentioned. And so even to countries that are seen as more traditionally supportive of Israel, Eastern member states, we can name some of them, Poland, but others, Visegrad countries, for them, I think, they also see their interests directly affected by annexation because they're also worried about Russia, what they fear may be Russia's continued territorial ambitions in that part of the world. And for them, there's the importance of standing up to annexation, I think is much greater than purely the question of Israel. I think they feel that there's going to be a need for the EU to do something to put its foot down, to send a message not just to Israel, but to Russia. And so I say that because I think, therefore, the group of countries that is extremely concerned and open to some sort of reaction to annexation is perhaps bigger than we'd see in the media. Now, in terms of what that reaction could be, I think it's still being discussed. I mean, I don't think anything is quite set on it, but I would say when one looks at statements that have been put out by member states within the UN Security Council, or things that are leaked in terms of demarches to the government, these are not just mere words. I would really encourage our Israeli friends to take these very seriously. It's words that are not only reflective of the concern, but also I think of underlying processes and discussions that are ongoing at the moment. And you mentioned Friday, but there's been other convenings, other discussions, and there's already, of course, a lot of discussion about what these reactions could be. And we can talk about some of the reactions, I think, in the next round. But to stick with the internal politics a bit more, I mean, of course, I mentioned the Eastern member states, the Visegrad, and I think even on this, the Visegrad is not as so that's Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. They're not as united on this as they have been on other issues. And I think as I mentioned, I think maintaining the prohibition on the acquisition of territory through force is important to many of them. Of course, they have to balance that also in relation to their relationship with the US, which is important, in terms of the US security umbrella that it provides for that part of the world. It's an important factor. But I think when you look at, and the same thing for Germany, when you look at its positioning, I think where the current disagreement is for most countries is not that this is in annexation is a concern, or that annexation will be a threat to a lot of EU interests. And even I think there's a consensus that there should be consequences. I really want to underscore that. The disagreement, I think, is more about timing. When should the EU come out with a declaration? Should the EU try to continue to work with the Americans? Should they try to give the new Israeli government some time to demonstrate what it's going to do? Now, for many of us, I think it's quite clear, but I think that's still one strand of thought within parts of some member states. Yes, we're concerned, but let's give it a bit more time. So I think that's kind of the lay of the land. Of course, there's the Hungarian exception. And let's be quite clear, the Hungarians have been consistently blocking everything. And we should call this out. And so I don't know how one can make consent, you can do consensus making with other member states. I think with the Hungarians, it's blocked. But what I really want to say is also, when you read Israeli media, threats of EU consequences are often dismissed. It's often, oh, it's just Borrell, the EU High Representative, or it's just some member states. And in any case, the Visegrad countries or Hungary, they'll protect us. But I think, for those who know the EU system, not everything has to be done. Not everything has to be done through consensus, through unanimous agreement of 27 member states. There are plenty of routes that can be explored, either at the member state level or institutionally, that to push forward measures absent 27 member states agreeing to it. And the final point, Germany as well. Look at Germany's statement to the UN Security Council. It was arguably not as strong as what France said, but I think one should take it still as a strong indication of its concern. And imagine that concern if annexation happens, and a lot of the things that that the EU considers it's worked for 30 years are no longer possible. I think then that in another world, another reality, and that will necessitate, or that will compel, a new set of policy responses from the EU.
Great. And I would just add, and maybe my colleague can throw this in the chat box, there is a thread on Twitter I started about a month ago, tracking all the statements as they come out from various state parties. So if we could maybe throw that thread into the chat box, it's just links to other people's statements. Moving on to Nora. Nora, most analysts see impending annexation as a doomsday scenario ushered in by the Trump administration. But as you've laid out, and I think it's been alluded to by others, the Trump administration policies are really a culmination of decades of US policy rather than a rupture with them. It may be a rupture in style more than substance, but it is a continuation. Can you talk about that? And I also want to grab something from the Q&A box, which is the question of whether or not, I think calling it a positive step be a bridge too far, but do you see formal annexation as opening the door for legal challenges in a way that is potentially productive for the Palestinians, where de jure annexation opening the door, where de facto left the door closed?
Yeah, I want to try to answer both those questions and maybe bring in some of the comments that have been said as well. My colleagues have shared here. I think one of the most exemplary indication that there has been a problem and we haven't necessarily been listening to Palestinians and what they've been telling us is even this panel and other panels like it and the increasing production of opinion pieces on it, because de facto annexation had already sealed the deal. We had already known since 1968 in Igal Alon's Alon plan that the Jordan Valley was going to be retained as a defensible border. Over and over, we heard Ariel Sharon tell us in 2001 there would never be withdrawal from the Jordan Valley because of the richness of water resources. We heard Netanyahu in front of Congress say that even in an agreement with Palestinians, there would never be withdrawal from the Jordan Valley. And now there's not going to be withdrawal even without the agreement with Palestinians. And why that's so notable is not only because the writing has been on the wall and this urgency should have always existed, as Palestinians have insisted it should have existed, but that de facto annexation provided the tools to use legal remedy to challenge Israel's obstinance. I mentioned, human rights law, but another law that's available and that has been available is the 1973 Convention condemning apartheid as a crime against humanity. And what you have as a result of de facto annexation is the overseeing of distinctive regulation of life based on racial difference, marked by the preservation of the superiority of one group. And so we've had all of these tools available to us. And now the reason I'm saying it's not doomsday is because we've known it. And in fact, but for the Oslo peace process, which laid out the jurisdictional regime of Area A, B, and C, now Area C precisely being the area that is up for grabs, which Israel has steadily removed Palestinians from, concentrated them into areas A and B. The reason I emphasize this is because it would not have been possible without the peace process. It's the peace process that's facilitating it and not Israel's violation of it, as well as the US's role in its commitment to Security Council Resolution 242 and the achievement of a political permanent peace. It has, obscured is too light. It has literally undermined all other avenues in international law, including at the Security Council, 43 vetoes on this issue, including in the international criminal tribunals, including even now in the efforts to undermine and criminalize BDS in order to overcome diplomatic intransigence. So I think this is a moment of reckoning for us. We can't put this on Trump because it would forgive all these 5 decades of supporting a peace process that was detrimental to the achievement of Palestinian self-determination, as well as supporting the US's primary role, which has been, as Rashid Khalidi points out in his newest book, in the next round, if there ever is to be a next round of negotiations, the US should not be a mediator, but the US should be sitting side by side along Israel on the other side of the table. This is a moment of reckoning. And unless we have that moment of reckoning, we're going to continue to produce the conditions that we're seeing now. This is not the worst that it can get. It can get much worse.
Excellent, thank you. Tamara, moving on to you. So we're gonna look now again at the US. So far, Joe Biden has refrained from publicly rejecting annexation or promising consequences. Probably not a big shock in terms of how it works politically, what you'd expect in an election campaign. In parallel, this week, we saw an effort by progressives in the Senate to warn Israel against annexation in a letter that was actually pretty meek. And that letter was pushed back and watered down to a point where it really sends a message that there will be no consequences for annexation, at least from Congress. And that letter is now actually being used as a campaign thing against Democrats. I saw something on Twitter from one of the groups that's more to the right, focusing on that letter. In this context, what do you think the response to actual annexation, not just a threat, but if it's actually carried out, would be in the US from Congress, from the political parties, assuming this happens in a period where we're in a campaign? We know the Trump administration is already giving a green light to it. So it's really a question of what Democrats and the Biden campaign would do in response. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I respect the cynicism with which you described the statements that have been issued so far in the US, but I actually don't agree with the characterizations that you made, either of what Biden has had to say so far or of the Senate letter that you just referred to. Biden, ironically, in his video for AIPAC in March, said very explicitly, Israel needs to stop the threats of annexation and settlement activity. Those were his exact words. So I don't think there's any lack of clarity about his view on the issue. And I think he said it directly to an audience that needed to hear it. Whether they absorbed it or not, I can't say. He said that threats of annexation and settlement activity, and he called out specifically a decision that had just been announced the day before about E1. He said they took off the hope for peace, they take Israel further away from its democratic values, and they undermine support in the United States for Israel. So I think that what you will probably see from the Biden campaign is continued reference back to that very clear statement. The Senate letter that is gathering signatures now is one in a series of, I think, slowly escalating statements of opposition from Democrats in Congress, starting about a year ago, actually, and when you had statements from some of the sort of foreign policy leaders in the House and Senate warning about annexation and unilateral steps. You then had individual statements coming out from Chairman Engel of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, from the leadership in both the House and Senate, Democratic leadership, and from a number of other senior Democrats, all of them warning about unilateral actions, some of them explicitly citing annexation, some of them not. This letter clearly spells out opposition to annexation. It clearly spells out why annexation is not in American interest and why it is harmful to the US-Israel bilateral relationship. What it doesn't do is it doesn't lay out the what if, the consequences. And I think there's a very simple reason for that, which is that if you want a loud alarm bell from those segments of the American political leadership that oppose this, if you want that alarm bell to be resounding, to have as many voices as possible behind it, then you don't want to have a debate over consequences for something that hasn't happened yet. You just want to say, stop. And you can get a maximum number of signatories by saying stop and not by, listing what you're going to do about it. I do think, though, and putting this in terms of what Hugh and Nora were saying, this is important. The potential consequences that they were laying out are quite real and quite meaningful. And I think that one of the assumptions that has guided Israeli thinking on annexation up until this point is that the United States administration would be actively working to shield Israel from consequences of this decision. And I have real questions, not just about whether even a Trump administration would be willing to actively shield Israel from some of the consequences Nora and Hugh were talking about. I have questions about whether it can. I think that even if we're facing a second Trump term, this is, as I said before, a president who's self-interested. He's not going to make decisions about this, based on some set of core principles, but based on his momentary political interests, and he will be a lame duck. We have seen him take decisions that are very much against Israel's interests without any consultation on Syria, for example. So I don't rule that out, number one. But number two, a lot of the consequences that Nora and Hugh are talking about are things the United States can't necessarily block or mitigate, or it can't do so without investing a lot of political capital that it may, prioritize elsewhere.
Great. Thanks to all of you. I want to take this conversation about consequences and costs and broaden it and look a little bit at the broader implications. Tamara, if I can stay with you for a minute, what do you see as possible implications for the U.S. With regard to its relationships with its allies or with the UN in the region, in the event, given the Trump administration's stance on annexation? In other words, is there a cost, political, diplomatic, or otherwise, to the United States for being so explicitly in favor of Israeli annexation?
Well, I think one major cost is the one that Hugh laid out, which is that our European partners are asking themselves whether they should even try to work with us on this question. I think that that's true across a range of issues, not only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so it's a consequence not just of Trump policy on annexation, it's a consequence of the Trump administration's foreign policy writ large. But the consequences of that for the United States will have a very long tail on this issue and on other issues. If, for example, the United States, and Khaled, you wrote wonderfully about this for the Brookings Institution some years ago, but if the United States created a mechanism like the Quartet, as a way of corralling other international actors like the UN and the EU into not moving very far away from American policy and remaining within an American consensus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we would not be able to build such a structure today. We are no longer living in a world where the United States is going to be the rate limiting step on international action toward Israel-Palestine. It's already happened. And so that's consequence number one. We're going to be on our own no matter where we are. Consequence number two, I think, is, that the US is going to have to weigh, and again, even a Trump administration, it's going to have to weigh the consequences of annexation for its other interests in the Middle East at a moment when the United States continues to try to want to do less in the Middle East, to turn its attention to other regions of the world, particularly on the military side, and where its bottom line interests in the region are about Iranian nuclearization, terrorist safe havens, and less, but still important, free flow of energy to global markets. And so from that perspective, if you're just looking like from a Pentagon national defense strategy kind of perspective, annexation is a massive headache. It's a hand grenade. It creates problems that we don't now have. And so I think even setting aside sort of left-right divides in American public opinion or American politics, in the cold light of American interests in the region at a moment when we're trying to do less, this might force us to do more. And that's going to make it unpopular. And then finally, I think you have to think about what this means for other areas of concern to the United States, the precedents that it sets. I think this was referred to earlier. You know, if you're thinking about Crimea or Western Sahara or Cyprus, it's really unhelpful for America's global interests to green light or give legitimacy to this kind of action. And, you know, even if the Trump administration, concerned with securing its evangelical base and getting Netanyahu's validation for its domestic political arguments, they're not thinking about that right now. The United States government is going to have to be thinking about that.
Great, thanks, Tammy. Turning now to Marwan and the region, where does annexation leave Israel's quote warming relations campaign with Arab states, particularly in the Gulf, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also others? And if I could tack on to that a question that is come up in the Q&A, you talked about Jordan's role specifically, and with regard to the status of its treaty. Do you think that Jordan will, in the event that de jure annexation happens, do you see Jordan putting its treaty with Israel on the line? Will it follow through on that? And what does that mean? Does that put Jordan and Israel back into a state of war? How does that work?
I think, Khaled, there are a number of issues here. First, Israel's relation with the Gulf, which at least at the leadership level seem to be progressing no matter what because of the Iran issue. And so the reaction to the annexation from, let's say, Gulf states in particular, and not all of them, is going to be one over time. It's not going to be an instantaneous reaction, in my view. Most people in the Gulf really look at the Palestinian issue in terms of Jerusalem, not in terms of how much territory will be, brought back to the Palestinians. And if it becomes clear that Jerusalem is lost forever because of the death of the two-state solution, I think Gulf leaders will have a very difficult time convincing their own people to accept a deal that does not involve Palestinian or Arab jurisdiction over East Jerusalem. This is one issue. The issue with Jordan, I mean, I think that the treaty should come under review. I'm not saying we should abrogate the treaty, but what I am saying is we entered into a peace treaty with Israel to preserve Jordan's sovereignty and to preserve Jordan's integral borders. If it is clear that the death of a two-state solution is going to threaten Jordan's security, then the peace treaty should be reviewed, because that's not an objective of the peace treaty. I think over time, and this is something not many people are talking about, one person who is talking about it is Ian Lustig, who I'm glad to see is among the participants today, is the one-state reality. We might not have a one-state solution. We do have a one-state reality. And if it becomes clear that the annexation is going to kill a two-state solution, then I think Arab states over time will have no choice but to join the growing number of Palestinians among the new generation who are shifting their focus from focusing on the shape of a solution to focusing on equal rights. If it becomes clear that annexation is not going to produce a Palestinian state, then the Palestinians have no choice but to call for equal rights within the territory or the authority that controls them. And let's imagine a situation, Khaled, 20 years from now, when the Palestinians will say to the international community, you either give us a state or you give us equal rights. What is the international community, including the American public? What is it going to say? No to a state and no to equal rights? Then what is basically saying is yes to apartheid. No community in the world 20 years from now is going to say yes to apartheid. Not the European Union, not the American public. And so this is exactly what annexation is leading to in the long term, a struggle for equal rights, if not for a Palestinian state.
Can I jump
thanks,
in?
Marwan. Sure, Tammy, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on Marwan's last point, and Khaled, I know you know this, but in the public opinion data we have on how Americans look at this conflict, I mean, we've seen a sort of generational shift with an increasing concern on human rights grounds. But it's also very clear in the data, and our colleague Shibli Tilhami has asked this question specifically: if no two-state solution is possible, what's your preference? And the overwhelming preference of Americans, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, independents, religion, ethnicity, doesn't matter. The overwhelming preference is one state with equal rights. Why? Because that's what we understand, right? We're American. Yes. That's, you know, so core to our understanding of what a state should be. And so I think that that is a reflection of what Marwan is saying about international opinion more broadly. I also think that the public opinion data on that in the US is so clear. And the beginning of that conversation about if two states are dead, what happens next? The beginning of that conversation is already having an effect and leading American policy analysts and elected leaders to think about what their next step is. And I think the only kind of domestically, politically acceptable American position, other than a negotiated two-state solution, is equal rights.
Great. So turning to Noura, I think that's a good segue to you. You've argued. I'm going to ask you a couple different questions. You've argued for pivoting away from bilateral to a multilateral framework in terms of conflict resolution. I think a lot of people would agree with that, especially given the U.S.'s track record. What does that look like in practical terms, and what is that? What does it entail, and what are the risks or benefits of kind of shifting to that kind of an approach? But also, I'm going to tack on a question that we had in the Q&A box about annexation, specifically, which you seem to give the impression that because annexation was sort of a clarifying moment, that it could somehow be a positive. Is that your view? Is it in fact a clarifying activity?
I had thought so. I'm a little confused myself because with respect to what my colleagues Tamara and Marwan are saying, despite all of this, it might take 20 years before we realize what's already very obvious to Palestinians for a long time. So I'm a little confused why we would need to wait another 20 years before we realize that Israel is not committed to a Palestinian state, that it has had the best opportunity to preserve its Jewish demographic majority, that it has the best opportunity to preserve with international support Zionist settler sovereignty by recognizing a Palestinian state, and yet has since 1993 torpedoed that possibility with the expansion of settlements, the building of the wall that's been condemned by the ICJ, what is called population transfer in Jerusalem, also known as ethnic cleansing, that has culminated in its annexation of East Jerusalem with US approval. We have seen the entrenchment of its settlement enterprise, including now with unabashed calls for annexation. We have seen them take on the entire international community by saying that the Golan Heights is part of Israeli territory, despite the fact that it's never been disputed as being under Syrian sovereignty. So for me and others, we're looking at this moment like we've told you so, and yet here I am on this call where the jury's still out, and that's very confusing to me. That's very confusing to me. Why, when Secretary of State Pompeo says that what Israel does is basically a matter of its, own prerogative, sovereign prerogative, and is actually there now to bless the unity government and annexation, we have in mind that, the US, hasn't really invested in this and might take a step back, and the international community might be able to take actions that it hasn't been able to take. We have to, so the reason I'm so confused is because for me, I'm reading all of this information and distilling it and coming to the conclusion that the US has been part of the problem, that our investment in this has led to this precise outcome, and that we're already late in pivoting away from the bilateralism that has exacerbated the power imbalance between Palestinians and the state of Israel, and should be pivoting to the international forum where all mechanisms of accountability could be deployed. And there, I think the conversation should be about why are other states hesitant to take up this mantle? Why is this such a lost cause for other capitals? Not when we wait, there will be equal rights. There's already a struggle for equal rights, and Palestinians have said so. There was, in 2017, a UNESCO report on apartheid that the US helped shelve that said that there was a single reality. And so the time is now to contend and accept that that reality is, this is the reality, not to question whether or not it's the reality. And now to get into the nitty-gritty of what do we have to do as advocates, as knowledge producers, as diplomats and former diplomats, in order to generate the political will to respond to this reality.
So I'm still curious for your answer to the question of whether annexation is a good thing in this context, or does it just not matter? You're saying it, de jure annexation doesn't matter at this point. It's
really, really hard and painful to say as a Palestinian that this outright violence is a good thing. To the extent, it's quite heartbreaking and it's devastating, especially considering the decades of Palestinian resistance and sacrifice when no one has been listening. So that's really hard for me to say, yes, I get it on an intellectual level, why this could be clarifying. That for me, the one good thing is maybe now people will believe us. On that level, yes. But as I've already said, that even with these developments, it's still, it still seems like we're deliberating whether or not this is the case on the call. So I have to take that back and say, maybe not. Maybe not.
Very, very compelling arguments all the way around. So I want to ask Hugh about implications of annexation for the EU as a body, as well as for individual member states. Is the EU policy on Israel-Palestine a casualty of eroding EU foreign policy consensus, or is it a catalyst for that erosion? And if I can ask, tack on some related question from the Q&A box, what can you point to that are specific concrete measures that the EU could take, or individual states, to either deter or perhaps even reverse, if it actually happens, Israeli annexation?
Thanks. So starting with the question of unity and or divisions, this would warrant another call, but I think those divisions have broadly always been there to a certain extent in terms of different views, perceptions towards international law, and et cetera. But I think it's clear that it's the Palestinian issue where that pressure on internal EU divisions has been the strongest. And I think that's why then you see these fissures often quite widening. But you could see the same sort of interplay often with the same sort of groups of member states play out. If you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, if you look at Syria, Libya, So it's far from exceptional to this issue, but I think it's often the Palestinians are often the canary in the coal mine, basically. So now in terms of implications, so I think the EU relations with Israel, I would kind of like describe them as a giant Jenga tower. And so, you're slowly pushing out one of the blocks and wondering if it's going to crumble. And I think let's be quite clear. I think, European governments, have, and I think we need to be very clear, have failed completely to live up to their commitments when it comes to defending international law, their so-called commitment to Palestinian statehood, state building, etc. And often the reasons for that, again, are quite complex, but often that is to do with, trying to preserve member state consensus. Imagine trying to get, 100 senators to agree to anything. That's, there's a structural issue there. And I think in the process, we've been, self-delusion has been quite important to us. So, this sort of vision that 2 states is still almost possible. If only we could get another peace process going, maybe this time it's possible. Some of that is, again, quite generally held belief and analysis, but a lot of it is just to avoid the more fundamental questions. In terms of if we acknowledge that 2 states is no longer possible, we have a big question, a lot of questions to answer in terms of our relation. What is the basis for our relationship with Israel, with the Palestinians, and so on and so forth. And so I think it's been a fig leaf. And I think in many ways now, if Israel does go through with annexation, I think it's gonna force the EU to have perhaps what's been a very overdue internal conversation with itself, amongst member states in terms of where we go next. And it's it's annexation and the consequences that produces. Again, if now the conclusion is 2 states is no longer possible, if we see the emergence of a 1-state reality of what the EU would call open-ended occupation and unequal rights, which other people would call apartheid. I think those sorts of things will put a lot of pressure on EU-Israeli relationship. And again, you start to push out the blocks, that giant Jenga tower. And so it's difficult to say when it crumbles, but I think a lot of the whole basis for the EU's relationship with Israel will be basically on the table and will have to be looked at and reviewed. So that's the longer term stuff. More immediate stuff in terms of what can we expect after annexation and in the coming months. I think and again, there's nothing agreed amongst member states, and don't expect anything on Friday in that regard. But I would say imagining what could happen over the coming months, for sure we'll see a deepening and hardening of what the EU calls its differentiation policy between Israel and the settlements. To Palestinians, that may seem completely insufficient. To some Israelis, that is tantamount even to pinning yellow stars on Jews. So there's different perceptions of that. But I think this idea, this legally necessitated requirement to exclude Israeli settlement entities and activities more fully from EU-Israel relationships, including potentially banning settlement products. I think this will be stuff that I personally would expect to be discussed. And that can also extend to other levels, social security, taxation, other bilateral agreements. And so I think that will continue both at the EU level and amongst member states and potentially groups of member states. And again, probably very little of this would require 27 member states to agree to anything. So that's the differentiation. And just to touch on 2 other bits. So I would also expect there to be a complete inability to agree to any future agreements with Israel. Because for new agreements, you need 27 member states to agree. So that's not going to happen after annexation. And then, as I said, I think there's a question about reviewing other components of the EU-Israel relationship, the association agreement, which is really the basis for everything. But then other things, financial loans, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot there, but don't expect everything to happen, immediately the day after.
Terrific. So going into what I think will probably be the final round of questions, Hugh, I want to stick with you for a second, and you actually already answered the question I was going to ask you, so I'm going to ask you something that I wonder about, and I'm actually surprised it hasn't come up in the Q&A box, which is the broader context for European policy right now, with the efforts to pass legislation that deems BDS to be anti-Semitic and lumps in a great deal of activism and support for the Palestinians into that category, an effort to have European countries, and we're seeing this increasingly in the US as well, but an effort to actually have countries adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that includes most activism that would be in support for or solidarity with Palestinians, and the campaign to, in effect, treat the entire Palestinian NGO sector, as well as the political echelons, as tainted by terror. And sort of just describing how that's working in Europe today. And, are there basically a couple of different clocks going on, the diplomatic clock on how you respond to annexation if it happens, and this grassroots clock, which is set to make it impossible to really do anything in response anyway?
Too simple to answer questions. So I think, there's this conflation of anti-Semitism with BDS, with differentiation, which we've obviously seen play out in the US. To a certain extent, it has played out in individual member states. I think Germany is a prime example of that. We've seen also legislation in France to criminalize BDS, basically. And the proposals in the UK to do something similar. I think in the European context, and this is not to justify it, but I think you have seen the conflation of anti-Semitism with BDS. You haven't seen the third element, which is then the conflation of those two with differentiation. I think that's, there have been attempts to try to do that, but that's always failed. So that's one of the small nuances. But having said that, I think, the European officials, the EU as an institution, and I think, most governments have, by and large, not gone along with measures to really, so France was legislation in parliament. So that's happened, and in Germany as well. But there's been, I think, a reluctance amongst governments to actually enact or to follow through and operationalize some of these things. And often we see that in terms of the parliamentary answers to parliamentary questions and pushing back. And the EU as a body has been very clear that, while it doesn't endorse BDS, it's free speech and it's not going to crack down on it. So it's a very unsatisfactory situation. And I think there is a clock that's ticking down, but I think there's structural impediments that mean that, efforts to replicate what's been happening in the US will be less successful here. And then in terms of, trying to I suppose, restrict funding to Palestinian NGOs over claims of terrorism, again, we've seen some relatively successful efforts to do that in different member states. But again, I think it's something that personally I find very troubling, and I think it's something that one needs to continue monitoring quite a bit. But it's difficult putting aside the rhetoric and some Israeli organizations, writing letters and publicizing those letters. I don't think there's yet been that many instances where funding has been specifically cut to Palestinian NGOs yet for their BDS positions or allegations that have been made to them. Although, there's been in the media quite a bit of discussion about this and with the Palestinian NGO network and these sorts of things. So again, I think it's something that's on the horizon, but it's not yet gone to the level that it is in the US. But one final point is that what does concern me, and I think there is a fundamental question. So it's not, it's not just about conflating organizations with terrorism or BDS, but it's also, how should the EU relate to Palestinian NGOs or that now actively advocate for equal rights or one state and not the two-state solution? And to me, and I think it's fair to say that there have been some instances which, although not formalized, there has been, some instances where some Palestinians have not been invited to certain forums because of their views. And to me, that is something that does concern me as much as any other effort to criminalize BDS or accuse NGOs of terrorism.
Thank you. Turning back to Tamara. So for a long time, we've talked about this, the analytical framework, the policy framework has been inside and outside government, has been about the two-state solution. How do you promote it? How do you save it? How do you get it back on track? Today, that framing seems overtaken by events. So where should the focus be now? Is the focus on trying to get things back on track? Is it looking at the possibility of shifting to a rights approach, which has been the Palestinian approach for a long time? What is there possibility at this moment for a breakthrough that allows for new thinking and new framing? Or is this really about, for most people, trying to get back to status quo ante, which was comfortable, if not actually delivering success?
Yeah, so I think that there is no going back to status quo ante. I think there is clear acknowledgement today of something that I think Nora would say we should have acknowledged a long time ago, which is that this Oslo structure is exhausted, broken, obsolete, unconstructive. It's not it, and there's no returning to it. I think that there's pretty widespread acknowledgement of that. In fact, that was one of the justifications that the Trump administration used in putting forward its own bizarre notions of how to approach this issue. So, so if we have consensus on that, where do we go? Analytically, I mean, yes, we can sort of work our way through what are the alternative arrangements between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground, legal arrangements, political arrangements, institutional arrangements that could produce peaceful coexistence in some form. And we can work our way through all of those possibilities. I remain skeptical that that type of analytical work, I think it's useful in terms of opening up the issues and getting people to think about possibilities, but I remain skeptical that any of it is useful from a policy perspective in terms of providing a pathway forward for American policy or any other international policy toward the conflict. And that's because fundamentally, the viability of those types of arrangements is dependent on the peoples on the ground who have to live with them, which was true of a two-state outcome also, right? And so to me, the analytical direction is starting with Israelis and Palestinians. And one consequence of being stuck in the Oslo paradigm for this much time has been that a whole lot of change in Palestinian public opinion in Palestinian civil society, in Palestinian thinking about the conflict has been sort of suppressed or marginalized or not brought into the conversation. That needs to change. And from an American perspective, that requires, as a prior step, rebuilding a relationship with Palestinians, with the PLO, with the PA, but with Palestinians that has been fundamentally ruptured by the policies of the last several years. Rebuilding that relationship, to me, is the most urgent task for American policy in terms of preparing for whatever we might be able to do in the future. And that's going to be some work. That's not a simple thing to do. As you know, Lara, it's not simple, partly because of legislative and other rules here in the United States, but it's also not simple politically or diplomatically. So to me, that's where to begin. And then you got to go way back to the beginning of a conflict resolution process, which involves pre-negotiation, sitting down with the parties, understanding how they view their interests, where those interests overlap, what kinds of engagement they are open to, and then asking what role do we play in that. I think that we no longer live in a world where the United States is effectively the owner of mediation efforts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what exactly that United States role looks like, I think, is something that we really are going to have to take some time to work out.
Thank you. And for folks who are listening and watching, we're going to keep this going to finish up this round. So we're going to go a little bit longer than planned. And I wish we could go another hour. It would still be interesting. So turning now to Marwan. We've talked about Arab governments. You talked about how difficult it would be for Arab governments to keep their public on board if Jerusalem is lost. But can you talk a little bit how today the issue of Palestine plays with the Arab public? And I'm saying Arab public as if that is a homogeneous thing. It obviously isn't. But is this a motivating and mobilizing issue in countries the way it was once, or has that changed? And if it still is, what kind of pressures does that bring?
I'm going to say something controversial, which is that it's irrelevant. The Arab public reaction is irrelevant today. I think the focus should be brought back to the Palestinians and the Palestinian issue. Tamara talked about, a paradigm that we all believed in, that we sold to the Palestinians, and basically told the Palestinians, okay, if you engage in this process, it's a 5-year process, 5 years, that's going to end with the end of the occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state. The Oslo agreements did not state that explicitly, but it was an understanding of the Palestinians and of all the Arabs that the reason they are in this process is because in 5 years, we're going to end the occupation and establish a Palestinian state. Today, to keep this charade, if you want, 25 years after, in which the two-state solution, has been killed 1,000 times, is basically, I keep saying, like two people arguing over a piece of pizza while one of them is eating it. We cannot talk about a peace negotiations anymore. We just cannot do that. It has no credibility. And it has no credibility among the new generation of Palestinians who believe, in my view, justifiably, that the international community has fooled them into going into a process that would end with the end of the occupation. Instead, 25 years later, they see 650,000 settlers amongst them and no possibility of a two-state solution. To keep talking about a two-state solution paradigm is to let the international community dodge its responsibilities, in my view. Today, I have no doubt that today Israel is an apartheid state. We could not have said that 5 years ago. It was taboo to even use the term. But today, there is no question about it. Nora would tell you, in legal terms, Israel today is an apartheid state. The international community has sort of ignored this fact. Why? Because the international community said, okay, Israel has violations, etc. But since we are all looking for a two-state solution, once there are two states and the Palestinians have their own state, then all of this becomes moot. Well, it is not moot. It is not moot at all. And I think that the Palestinians who as we have said before, who should be and are calling for equal rights, should put the international community among its, to face their responsibilities. You can no longer tell the Palestinians, we are not going to give you a state and we are not going to accept your call for equal rights. That's basically saying to the Palestinians, we are supporting an already existing apartheid state. I'm sorry to use these words, but in my view, this is the reality that we are facing today. Israel can no longer have the cake and eat it too. If they want annexation, ahlan wa sahlan. We want equal rights. And let's see where that leads. But for Israel to say, we are going to selectively annex those territories that we want, and then throw the rest out, should not become an option for Mr. Netanyahu. Instead, in my view, Palestinians should say, you want annexation? Ahlan wa sahlan. All of it, with equal rights. And that will shift the focus of the struggle dramatically and in ways that are not for the benefit of Israel in the long term.
Thank you. And Nora, my question to you, which actually follows kind of organically from the last two answers. You've talked about U.S. policy on Palestine, the question of Palestine, treating the Palestinians sort of as shadows. I would use the term non-player characters, NPCs, like in a video game. They have a short list of allowed responses. They're expected to play a certain role, and if they go off it means the programming's wrong, and they have to be, somehow replaced with something that will play, characters that will play the role. That's my nerd framing. For you, what would the meaningful inclusion of Palestinians have looked like? So looking back, but more looking forward. Yes, how would that have changed the outcome? But looking forward, what should it be? And this will be the last response, and then we'll do closing remarks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think I kind of answered that in the previous question of, what does it mean to look at this from the vantage point of Palestine? So I'm in the United States as well. I teach here, I've done advocacy here. And so based on, my anecdotal, knowledge and observations, and especially when I was working on the Hill, this issue has been discussed as a matter of either US-Israeli relations or an internal Jewish conversation to be had on Zionism and where it fits in, Jewish self-determination and traditions, but and thereby casting Palestinians. I like the way that you framed it, NPCs. I saw that we're shadows. Even in the writing on history or this current moment, they don't figure as players. They're objects that things happen to, and very rarely are they subjects who can do something unless they're inflicting violence, in which case they take on their full embodiment of subjecthood. So the thing that I would say, just a few things in response and moving forward in response to your question. One, as we think about equal rights, it's really important to think about not just equality and political sovereignty as the horizon, where now Palestinians will enjoy equal Israeli citizenship, but because this is of a colonial nature, there has to be a decolonial element in the process towards equality. Palestinians don't merely want an equal right to vote, but equally want a right to self-determination and to belonging on those lands. And because now many, even on the Israeli right, are fine with Palestinians being there, but not with national rights. They can be there as minorities. They can be there as, Israeli Arabs, right? Even within the citizens of Israel, they are regarded as an ethnic minority, but not as a national minority with the right to self-determination. And that has to be key. And we know from the July 2018 nation state law, the Knesset has declared Israel as a Jewish state where only Jews have the right to self-determination, making settlement a matter of constitutional obligation. I mean, we have all of this information. So what it's going to take is not merely saying make Palestinians equal, but also acknowledge Palestinians are native. Palestinians are there because they've always been there. And this is a right of belonging, and this is a right of self-determination. In terms of Palestinian responsibility, here I just want to take the Palestinian leadership to task. They have not been hapless victims. They have played into this. And I agree, reading the documents and, I have a chapter on Oslo where instead of translating Oslo into, translating the legalese into something we can all understand, upon reading the documents, I thought to myself, my God, you only have to be literate. You don't have to be a lawyer to see this. And so I set out to answer the question of why would the PLO enter this? And how did Israel and the United States achieve their acquiescence? And the PLO and the leadership itself will tell you they did it on faith. And this is based on interviews as well as documents. They did it on faith. And as Marwan has pointed out, 25 years should be enough to eviscerate that faith so that we can act on empirical evidence of what needs to be done. And so the Palestinian leadership, by playing into this, by emphasizing, putting most of its energy on proving its eligibility to the United States and to Israel, that it could be a state, that it can provide security for Israel, that it can compete against Hamas and make Hamas its primary target as opposed to the occupation or the evisceration of their right to self-determination. The fact that even now, with all the evidence on the wall, the Palestinian leadership has shunned the Trump administration, but not the United States. And they're just waiting for a better alternative to Trump to ascend, and the fact that after all of this, they have not even endorsed, the Palestinian civil society call for BDS as an extra diplomatic path that affirms their freedom struggle as continuing. Palestinian leadership has been so invested in representing a state as opposed to representing a freedom movement, that the reason that we're not seeing a more forthright response to de jure annexation is because they're going to pay the highest cost, which is that they lose that mantle of being able to lead their nascent state, their inchoate state, as opposed to taking the responsibility, which is we are still struggling for freedom. And so this is also, as we're pointing out internally, this is responsibility also for the Palestinian leadership in making room for other leadership that has a better vision, or at least maybe not better, but it hasn't been unequivocally demonstrated as nonsensical through 25 years of empirical evidence. And so it's worth a try.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noura. I mean, I know we've gone over time, and thank you all for indulging us. Lara, do we have time for a lightning round of closing statements?
This is going to cut off in 3 minutes. They're going to lose the video feed.
Okay, so everyone has 30 seconds. Let's start with Tamara.
All I meant by that was that this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm not sure I have anything more to add. So thank you for including me.
Thanks for joining us. I guess in that case, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, Tamara, Noura, Marwan, and Hugh. Thank you, Lara. On behalf of Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Middle East Institute, I want to thank all our panelists and everyone who tuned in. If you want to learn more about the issues we've been discussing here today, you can follow all of our panelists and their organizations on Twitter. I encourage you to visit their websites and also find them in social media. You can check back at the MEI or FMEP websites for a recording of this webinar and further resources on this topic. As Lara noted earlier, today's webinar is part 1 of a 3-part series exploring the issues related to Israeli annexation of lands it occupied in 1967. Part 2, which will be this Friday at 11 a.m., will feature perspectives from Palestine, and part 3 next Monday will feature perspectives from Israel. You can find more information on how to register for these sessions on mei.edu and fmep.org. And once again, thanks to our panelists and thanks to you all.